On a quiet afternoon, in a neighborhood that prided itself on trimmed lawns and freshly painted fences, the air carried a strange stillness. It was the kind of place where residents nodded politely at one another, where HOA meetings were treated with more seriousness than town hall gatherings, and where peace and order often meant something very different, depending on who you asked. The houses stood like polished shells of perfection, each one nearly identical, hiding whatever tension or resentment brewed behind closed doors. It was a neighborhood built on the idea of safety, yet beneath the surface there was a constant hum of suspicion, an invisible current that seemed to grow stronger whenever someone didn't quite fit the mold. On that particular day, the streets were unusually empty, the heat pushing most people indoors. The only real movement came from the occasional jogger, the sound of sprinklers clicking on and off, and the hum of a lawnmower a few blocks down. Yet in the middle of this suburban calm, a moment was beginning to take shape that would shatter the image of harmony this community tried so hard to project. The woman who lived on the corner had always seen herself as a kind of watchdog. She knew every face, every car that belonged, and every minor change in the rhythm of her street. Neighbors called her involved, though others whispered words like nosy and controlling. She carried herself with a sense of authority that wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone felt it. Her influence seeped through HOA rules and neighborhood gossip, and her need to keep things under control was as much about her fears as it was about community order. She had a way of looking at people that was sharp and measuring, as though she were weighing their right to exist in the space around her. To some, it was just her personality. To others, it was unsettling. But no one ever truly challenged her, not directly. Most people preferred to stay out of her way. Across the street, a man stood by his car, leaning casually as he adjusted something at his waist. He wasn't loud. He wasn't causing trouble. He was simply there, blending into the rhythm of the day. But his presence didn't go unnoticed. For the corner house woman, that moment felt charged. She saw him not for who he was, but for who she decided he must be. His skin, his stance, the faint outline of what she thought she saw. It all collapsed into a story she had already written in her mind. Before she even fully understood what she was doing, her hand was already on her phone. The words came quickly, heavy with the weight of certainty. She said she saw a man with a gun. To her, that was enough to explain the tremor in her voice, enough to justify summoning the power of the police to her quiet street. What she didn't know, or maybe what she didn't stop to consider, was that she had just set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. The man she had reported was no stranger to authority. He wore it every day, carried it like a second skin. His job had shaped him into someone who could walk into chaos and remain steady, someone who had seen the best and worst of humanity in equal measure. But in that moment, standing under the unforgiving sun, he was simply himself, off-duty, relaxed, unaware that his identity was about to be questioned in the cruelest way possible. Neighbors who glanced through blinds or peeked out from porches saw nothing out of the ordinary. Some recognized the man, though they didn't speak up. Others simply shrugged and went back to their routines. The quiet before the storm often looks like nothing at all. But the corner house woman's call had already sliced through that stillness, carrying with it all the weight of misunderstanding, fear, and bias. For the man at the center of it, the world hadn't shifted yet. He was still in the bubble of normalcy, unaware of how quickly perception could turn dangerous. He had faced threats before, but they had always been clear, direct. This was different. This was an invisible kind of danger, the kind that didn't announce itself until it was already too late. The police response would be fast. It always was when certain words were spoken over the line. And when those sirens pierced the calm of the neighborhood, the fragile balance of normal life would begin to collapse. The children inside their homes, the jogger down the street, the couple trimming hedges, all of them would look up, drawn to the sound of authority arriving. none of them knew that what began as a false assumption would unravel into a scene no one would forget. The woman on the corner would watch from her window, a mixture of nerves and satisfaction curling in her chest. She had acted quickly, she would tell herself. She had kept her neighborhood safe. Yet beneath that convict suit, Tyan was something darker, something that hinted at a truth she would never fully admit, not even to herself. That this wasn't about safety, it was about control. And in just 42 seconds, the story she thought she had created would fall apart, replaced with a reality she couldn't have imagined. Because the man she had called the cops on wasn't a threat at all. He was the law, and when the officers arrived, it wouldn't be him facing their guns, but her facing the weight of her mistake. The sound of sirens cut through the still afternoon, slicing into the illusion of peace that the neighborhood worked so hard to protect. Children stopped mid-play, their games interrupted by the echo of authority rushing in. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open just enough for eyes to peer out. And in the center of it all, the man who had been standing quietly by his car suddenly found himself caught in the kind of storm he had spent years trained to control. Except this time, he wasn't the officer rushing in. He was the suspect. 2 patrol cars turned the corner faster than anyone expected, tires screeching lightly against the pavement. They stopped with precision, doors flying open, hands reaching instinctively for holsters. The corner house woman watched with her heart racing, a strange thrill in her chest, as if she were both the audience and the director of a play she had written. In her mind, she was the hero who had seen danger where others might have looked away. The man barely had time to register what was happening. He raised his hands automatically, a gesture born from both instinct and training. His voice was calm, even steady, though inside he felt the sting of disbelief. He had been in this situation before, but always on the other side. This time, the uniform wasn't on him. It was tucked neatly in his car, his badge resting in his pocket. He knew what could happen if he moved too quickly, if he spoke too sharply, if he gave the smallest reason for doubt. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," one of the officers barked, his voice sharp, echoing across the quiet street. The man obeyed, his body language measured, his movements deliberate. In his head he was counting seconds. He knew how fast things could turn. The woman leaned against her window, her phone still in her hand, ready to capture proof if she needed it. She felt justified, even proud. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't imagine, was that her words had placed not just a man, but an entire chain of trust, honor, and brotherhood under fire. It only took moments. One of the officers noticed the badge clipped to his belt, half covered by his shirt. Another caught sight of the ID inside his wallet as he reached slowly, carefully, to show them. And then, like a switch flipping, the energy shifted. The tension that had filled the air began to break, not because of the woman's warning, but because of the truth staring them into the face. The salute came quickly, a gesture of recognition and respect. 42 seconds. That's how long it took to go from a man nearly branded as a criminal to a man honored for the very authority he carried. The woman's story cracked instantly, her sense of control slipping as she realized what she had done. But the damage was not as easily undone. The neighborhood had watched. Children had seen. Men and women standing behind blinds had witnessed how easily perception turned dangerous, and though the officers left without incident, the aftermath of those seconds lingered like a shadow no one could shake. For the man, it was not the salute that stayed with him, but the memory of what came before it. The cold eyes of suspicion, the stiff grip on weapons, the silence of neighbors who chose not to speak. He knew how close the line had been, how fragile his safety truly was. And though he smiled politely, though he shook hands with the officers and brushed it off with practiced ease, something inside him cracked. He had worn the badge for years, but in those seconds he had been seen as nothing more than a threat. The woman on the corner tried to retreat into silence, but the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some defended her, saying she was just being careful. Others condemned her, their voices sharp with anger. But behind closed doors, even those who excused her knew the truth. Her call had not come from fear alone. It had come from something deeper, something uglier, something no one wanted to name aloud. Tension didn't end that day. It grew. The man found himself scanning faces differently, noticing the way people looked at him when he walked down his street. He felt the weight of eyes, the silence that followed him. His family noticed too. His wife urged him to let it go, but his children asked quiet questions he struggled to answer. Why did she think you were Nungarus? Why did they point guns at you? The woman meanwhile doubled down. She told her side at the next HOA meeting, her voice sharp, defensive, insisting she had done the right thing. She twisted her words, insisting she had seen something dangerous, refusing to admit fault. The meeting became a battlefield of voices, neighbors divided, tempers flaring, the fragile order of the community cracking open for the first time. Past grievances resurfaced. Old complaints about her domineering ways, her relentless policing of mailbox heights, lawn colors and fence paint spilled into the room. People who had stayed silent for years found themselves emboldened, fueled by the shame of what she had done. Yet there were others, those who clung to her authority, who saw her as a shield for their own fears, who defended her actions with the same blind certainty she had displayed on the phone. Lines were drawn, friendships strained, families stopped waving at each other across the street. What had once been a pristine neighborhood of perfect lawns now carried invisible cracks in its foundation. The sound of sprinklers and lawnmowers still filled the air, but underneath, there was an unspoken awareness that trust had been shattered. For the man, it wasn't just about what happened, it was about what it revealed. He began to question the value of the badge he wore, wondering how much it protected him outside the uniform, outside the shield of authority. He thought about the men he had arrested, the people who had stared at him with fear or anger, and he wondered how many of them had felt the way he did in those 42 seconds. Vulnerable, misunderstood, alone. The woman wrestled with something she couldn't name. At night, when the house was quiet, she replayed the moment in her head. The sirens, the commands, the way the officers' stances changed when they recognized him. She felt a gnawing sense of embarrassment she quick, lie buried under layers of pride and denial. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had revealed herself. The neighborhood itself became the stage for a growing divide. Every glance, every word, every silence carried weight. And though no blood had been shed, though no crime scene tape had been drawn across those perfect lawns, the air carried the tension of something unresolved, something that would only grow heavier with time. The moment was over, but the story wasn't finished. It had only just begun. The evening was heavy with silence, the kind that clings to the air before a storm breaks. The neighborhood, usually so pristine and orderly, now felt charged with tension that had been building for weeks. The HOA meetings had grown into shouting matches. Neighbors whispered about betrayal, about lies, about the woman on the corner who had sparked something too dangerous to contain. For the man, each day that passed carried the weight of the 42 seconds that had nearly stolen his life. The memory of guns aimed at him never left his mind. It had become a shadow he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to bury it under routine. On that night, the streets were unusually quiet. Porch lights glowed faintly, casting yellow halos on trimmed grass. The cicadas hummed, but their sound seemed drowned out by something darker, an energy that felt alive, pulsing, waiting. The man had returned home late, his body tense from another long shift, his thoughts weighed down with questions of trust, dignity, and betrayal. He pulled into his driveway, headlights sweeping across the neat hedges and the spotless concrete path. But his sense of safety, once tied to his own home, was gone. Every movement in the shadows made his heart race. Every glance from a neighbor's window felt like judgment. Across the street, the woman watched. She had grown restless, her pride scratched raw by the fallout of her call. Once her authority had been unshakable. Now, whispers followed her. She told herself over and over that she had been right, that she had acted in the name of safety. But deep down, that gnawing voice returned, telling her she had been wrong, that she had exposed herself for what she truly was. She hated that voice. She hated him for being the proof of it. In her mind, the man had become more than just a neighbor. He had become a symbol of her slipping control. Every time she saw him walk past her house, calm and dignified, a badge tucked discreetly at his side, she felt her grip on the neighborhood loosening. To her, he wasn't just a man. He was a threat to everything she had built, her authority, her reputation, her place in the pecking order of the street. That night, their paths collided. The man, tired but restless, stepped out into the humid night air. He walked toward his mailbox, the crickets chirping all around him. It should have been a simple, quiet act. Instead, it felt like stepping into a spotlight. He noticed movement at the corner house, her blinds shifting, her silhouette in the glow of the lamp. His jaw clenched. He was tired of being watched, tired of the suspicion. "Do you ever stop?" His voice carried across the street, calm but edged with anger. Her blinds moved again, and then the door opened. She stepped out, arms folded tightly across her chest, her face tight with disdain. "You don't belong here the way you think you do," she said, her voice sharp, carrying the bite of all her pent-up bitterness. The words hit him harder than he expected. Not because they were new. He had felt them in her stares, in her silence, but because she finally said them aloud. He felt the sting of humiliation burn through him, stronger than the heat pressing against his skin. "You called them on me," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. "You put my life in their hands like it was nothing." She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her chin as if daring him to continue. That silence was worse than words. It was confirmation that she would never see him for who he was, only for what she feared. The space between them shrank as their words grew sharper, louder. Neighbors stirred behind closed windows. Lights flicked on. What began as a confrontation turned into an explosion of months of tension. Her pride, his anger, her denial, his pain colliding in a storm neither of them could control. Then it happened. It was sudden, chaotic, and impossible to take back. The argument spilled into violence, a shove, a desperate grab, a flash of something metallic under the porch light. The moment cracked open like glass shattering. Her hand reached, his instincts flared, and in the tangle of bodies and rage, the sound of a gunshot split the night. The echo rolled through the street, louder than any siren, more final than any word. For a second, the world froze. The cicadas went silent. The neighbors held their breath. And then came the screams. She staggered backward, her face pale with shock, her hand trembling as if even she didn't understand what she had just done. The gun, small and shaking in her grip, clattered to the pavement. The man stumbled, clutching his side, his eyes wide, not with anger, not with hate, but with disbelief. He had faced danger countless times, but he never imagined it would come from his street, from the woman who had been watching him with that cold certainty all along. His knees buckled, his body collapsing onto the driveway. His breath came shallow, desperate, the night air thick with iron. In his mind images flashed, his children's faces, his wife's voice, the life he had fought to build, slipping from him in the place he was supposed to feel safe. The woman's chest heaved as panic set in. The reality of what she had done began to crawl over her skin like fire. She stepped forward, then back, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. Her first instinct was to call for help, but the screen blurred through her tears. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak into the line, her words tumbling out incoherently. I didn't mean... I thought Neighbors rushed out, some screaming, some frozen in place. One man knelt by the fallen officer, pressing his hands against the wound, shouting for someone to bring towels, to call faster, to do something. The scene spiraled into chaos, cries overlapping with the rising wail of sirens in the distance. The woman backed away, shaking her head over and over, muttering to herself. She tried to rationalize it in real time, clinging to the idea that she had been defending herself, that he had scared her, that the line between fear and hate had blurred too quickly. But deep down she knew. This wasn't about defense. It was about power, about pride, about everything she couldn't admit to herself. The man's last coherent thought was of bitter irony, that the same call that once summoned guns on him now summoned them again, only this time there was no badge to save him. No salute, just blood soaking into his driveway. The flashing lights arrived too late. Officers swarmed the scene, shouting commands, pulling the woman away as she screamed her innocence, her voice breaking into high-pitched denial. The neighbors stood in stunned silence, the perfect facade of their neighborhood shattered forever. The street that once smelled of fresh-cut grass and barbecue smoke now smelled of gunpowder and fear. The driveway, once a place where children drew chalk outlines of hopscotch, was now marked by blood and siren light. The crime was not just the shot that rang out. It was everything that led to it. The fear, the prejudice, the silence of neighbors who chose not to intervene, the pride of a woman who couldn't admit fault, and the quiet despair of a man who only wanted to live with dignity in his own home. And in that moment, the neighborhood's unspoken truths were laid bare for everyone to see. The days after the shooting fell over the neighborhood like a storm cloud that would not pass. What had once been a place of manicured lawns and forced smiles now felt heavy with silence. The street where children once played kickball became a place where parents pulled them back inside. Conversations were clipped, whispers sharp, and even the sound of sprinklers hissing at dawn carried a strange sadness. The gunshot had not just torn through one man's body, it had split the community in two. The man's house became a gathering point for grief. His wife, her face drawn and pale, moved like a ghost through the rooms, clutching at items that still carried his touch. A jacket draped on a chair, the mug he had left on the counter. At night, she sat awake with the sound of the sirens replaying in her head, the echo of her husband's last breaths pressing down on her. Their children were quieter than usual, their questions hanging in the air unanswered. Why did she do it? Didn't they know Daddy was good? Their innocence made the weight of the tragedy heavier, their voices carrying the kind of pain no child should have to carry. At the corner house, the woman's life unraveled differently. She sat in a holding cell the first night, her hands trembling so badly she could barely drink the water they gave her. She told anyone who would listen that it had been self-defense, that she was scared, that he came at her. But the more she repeated the words, the hollower they sounded, even to herself. When she was released on bail, her once pristine home became a fortress of shame. Blinds were kept closed, trash piled up by the curb. Neighbors who once nodded to her now turned away. She tried to cling to her old sense of authority, telling herself she was still right, that the neighborhood would one day see she had acted out of fear, not hate. But in the quiet of her empty living room, she couldn't outrun the images that replayed in her mind. The shock in his eyes, the sound of the gun, the sight of his body collapsing. At night, she woke up sweating, her chest heaving, convinced she heard the echo of his voice accusing her. The community itself was fractured. At HOA meetings, the tension boiled over. Some residents defended the woman, claiming she had made a mistake but not a crime, and that fear could push anyone into irrational action. Others demanded justice, their anger raw as they called her dangerous, reckless, unfit to live among them. Families who had once shared backyard barbecues now avoided each other, the lines drawn too sharply to erase. The media descended quickly. News vans lined the streets, cameras pointing toward the blood-stained driveway. Headlines painted the neighborhood as a microcosm of something bigger: race, authority, fear, and justice colliding in a place that had once pretended those problems didn't exist. The man was hailed as a hero, his years of service and dedication recounted in stories that praised his courage. Photos of him in uniform filled the news cycle, a reminder of the life that had been cut short not by a stranger, but by someone who had once lived just steps away. For the woman, the coverage was merciless. Old clips from HOA meetings surfaced, videos of her berating neighbors for trivial things: the color of a fence, a car parked too long on the curb. Her face, once familiar only to those on her street, became infamous. She was no longer just the corner house woman. She was a symbol of paranoia, of prejudice, of control gone too far. The court of public opinion branded her before the legal trial even began. The psychological toll rippled outward. The officers who had arrived that night replayed their actions, some of them haunted by how close they had come to treating him like a suspect months earlier. One officer confided to a colleague that he couldn't stop thinking about the salute, that gesture of respect so quickly followed by a tragedy they couldn't undo. Neighbors who had stayed silent carried guilt, wondering if speaking up sooner could have changed the outcome. The man's family lived in two worlds at once. They grieved privately, mourning a husband and father, while also carrying the weight of public sympathy. Strangers sent flowers, donations, and cards, but no amount of support could ease the emptiness in their home. His wife found herself replaying their last conversation over and over, clinging to his words as if they could shield her from the reality of his absence. For the woman, isolation became unbearable. Friends stopped answering her calls. Even her relatives kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with the infamy her actions had brought. She wrote letters to the court, to the media, to anyone who might listen, insisting she hadn't meant for it to happen. She said the gun went off by accident. She said she had been terrified. But each letter felt less like a defense and more like a desperate attempt to rewrite what everyone else already knew. The trial loomed like a storm. Prosecutors framed her actions as reckless at best, malicious at worst. Her defense clung to fear, painting her as a woman overwhelmed by the belief that she was in danger. But beneath the legal arguments, the heart of the case was raw. She had made a choice rooted not in reality, but in the shadows of her prejudice and pride. The community that once prided itself on harmony became a cautionary tale. Reporters described it as fractured, broken by distrust. Real estate signs popped up on lawns as families quietly planned to leave, unwilling to raise children on a street where blood had stained the pavement. The myth of safety was gone, replaced with the truth of fragility, that beneath the surface of any perfect place lies the potential for disaster. In the quiet aftermath, those who had lived through it carried scars invisible to outsiders. Some replayed the moment over and over, unable to shake the image of flashing lights and blood on concrete. Others retreated into silence, choosing not to speak of it at all. But no one remained untouched. The woman sat in her house, blinds drawn, waiting for the trial that would decide her future. The man's family tried to piece together a life without him, their grief a constant reminder of the price of a single choice. And the neighborhood itself stood as a monument to what happens when fear and pride outweigh empathy and truth. The crime had ended in seconds, but its aftermath stretched endlessly, winding through every life it touched. The gunshot was gone, but its echo still hung in the air, refusing to fade. The trial became the final stage for everything that had been simmering since that afternoon, when a single phone call had shifted the course of so many lives. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case from afar. On one side sat the man's family, their grief visible in every gesture, their faces hardened not only by loss, but by the exhaustion of reliving his death again and again in testimony, photographs, and arguments. On the other side sat the woman, thinner than she once was, her hair grayer, her hands constantly fidgeting. She tried to meet no one's eyes, yet she could not escape the weight of their stares. The legal battle was fierce. The prosecution painted her as reckless and blinded by prejudice, someone whose obsession with control had escalated into tragedy. They showed the jury recordings of her past HOA rants, played the 911 call where her voice trembled not with fear, but with an edge of certainty, as though she wanted danger to exist so she could justify her power. The defense leaned on fear, arguing she had been overwhelmed, that her mind had tricked her into believing she was in danger, that anyone could have made the same mistake. But even as her lawyers spoke, it was clear the jury could see through the cracks. When the verdict came, guilty of manslaughter, the courtroom was silent for a long moment. The woman closed her eyes, as if she had been expecting it but still couldn't quite believe it. The man's family clutched each other's hands, tears falling, not out of joy, but out of the painful relief that at least some accountability had been reached. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. But the cost of that justice was a life that could never be restored, and a community that could never be the same. Her sentencing brought no celebration. She was given years in prison, her house repossessed, her name forever attached to the crime. She had once been the loudest voice in her neighborhood, the self-appointed guardian of order. Now she was reduced to a number in the prison system. Another story of fear turned deadly. For her, the punishment was not just the sentence itself, but the silence she was forced to sit in, the loss of power, the absence of an audience, the reflection she had avoided for years, finally unavoidable. For the man's family, life went on, though never as it had been. His wife returned to work eventually, carrying his memory with her in small ways, a photo on her desk, the badge he once wore framed in their living room. His children grew older, their understanding of the world shaped by the day they learned even good men could be destroyed by lies and fear. Their pride in their father's service was matched by the ache of his absence. The driveway where he had fallen was repaved, but to them, it would always be sacred ground. The neighborhood never recovered fully. Houses went up for sale, families moved away, and the once tightly wound community unraveled. For those who stayed, the memory lingered in whispers and in the quiet tension that surfaced whenever strangers walked down their street. The HOA lost its authority, its meetings sparsely attended, its rules ignored. The illusion of harmony was gone, and with it, the false comfort that order could erase deeper fractures. The broader world did not forget either. The case became a headline, a talking point on news channels, a hashtag on social media. For some, it was proof of how dangerous unchecked suspicion could be. For others, it was a reminder of how fragile safety truly was, even for those who carried badges and upheld the law. Discussions about race, authority, and fear filled television panels and dinner tables alike, each person interpreting the story through their lens. In the end, the case became more than just a neighborhood tragedy. It was a mirror held up to society, exposing the ways fear can twist into violence, how authority can be misused by those who don't officially hold it, and how pride can blind people to their faults. It revealed how quickly respect can be stripped away, how easily dignity can be denied, and how fragile the idea of justice is. Morality in this story was never simple. The woman wasn't a monster in the beginning. She was a neighbor, a person who had convinced herself she was protecting her community. Yet her desire for control, her inability to see beyond her prejudice, transformed her into something destructive. The man wasn't just a victim. He was someone who carried the weight of authority with quiet dignity, who tried to live his life in peace, only to find himself undone by the very system he believed in. The power dynamics between them were stark. One carried real authority, yet was stripped of it, in the eyes of someone who refused to see him as anything but a threat. The other had no formal power but wielded influence like a weapon, using fear and suspicion to bend others to her will. Their clash was inevitable, their conflict a reflection of something larger than themselves. In the end, justice was both served and denied. The woman faced consequences, but no sentence could balance the scales of what had been lost. The man's family carried their grief into the future. The community bore its scars, and the world outside shook its head at yet another story of suspicion turned fatal. What remains is not the moment of the gunshot, but everything it revealed. How fear can masquerade as vigilance, how pride can disguise itself as responsibility, and how quickly the fragile bonds between neighbors can be torn apart. The story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about prejudice, about authority, about what it means to truly keep a community safe. The driveway was repaved, the headlines faded, and the neighborhood grew quieter with time. Yet the lesson lingers. The cost of control, the weight of fear, and the irrevocable truth that once a life is taken, there is no going back.